4 astronauts, the most powerful rocket ever built, a mission that cost over $90 billion, and not a single one of them will set foot on the moon. NASA calls it a historic leap forward. Critics call it a detour dressed up as progress, and somewhere between those two positions lies a truth far more complicated and far more fascinating than either side wants to admit. Because Artemis II isn't the mission they're telling you it is. If space fascinates you, a like and subscribe means everything to us. Let's begin. Here's what you've been told. Artemis II will send 4 humans farther from Earth than any human being has travelled in over half a century. The mission, currently targeted for 2026, will carry astronauts Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen on a sweeping arc around the moon. A free return trajectory that will bring them to within roughly 8,900 kilometres of the lunar surface before slinging them back toward Earth. The journey will last approximately 10 days. It will be humanity's first crewed lunar mission since Apollo 17 touched down in the Taurus-Littrow Valley in December 1972. That's the official story, and on the surface, it sounds extraordinary. But here's the question nobody in the press conferences is asking with enough urgency. If we've been building toward a return to the moon for decades, if the entire Artemis program exists specifically to put boots on the lunar surface, why is this mission, with all its cost and complexity, not landing? To understand the answer, we need to go back further than most people realise. The Apollo program ended not because humanity had finished exploring the moon. It ended because the political and financial architecture that made Apollo possible had crumbled. The Vietnam War was draining the national treasury. Public enthusiasm had peaked with Apollo 11 and was declining with each subsequent mission. NASA's budget, which had consumed nearly 4.5% of the entire federal budget at its peak in 1966, was being slashed year after year. Apollo 18, 19 and 20, fully funded and partially built missions, were cancelled. The hardware was sent to museums, and the institutional knowledge, the tens of thousands of engineers who had built and operated Saturn V, began to scatter. What followed were decades of near-moon ambitions that never quite crystallized. The space shuttle, brilliant in its own right, was designed for low Earth orbit. The International Space Station became humanity's home in space, but it orbits at roughly 400 kilometers above Earth's surface, a fraction of the 384,000 kilometers that separate us from the moon. Constellation, the program that was supposed to return Americans to the moon under President George W. Bush, was cancelled in 2010 after consuming $9 billion and producing little more than a test vehicle and a generation of frustrated engineers. Then came Artemis, formally announced in 2017 and accelerated in 2019 under the mandate to reach the moon by 2024, a deadline that has since slipped, expanded and been quietly renegotiated. Artemis is NASA's most ambitious human spaceflight program in 50 years. At its core is the Space Launch System, or SLS, a rocket of staggering proportions. The Block 1 configuration stands 98 meters tall, generates 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, and is currently the most powerful operational launch vehicle on Earth. Strapped to its top is the Orion spacecraft, a capsule designed to carry up to 4 crew members on deep space missions, equipped with a European-built service module that provides propulsion, power, and life support beyond Earth orbit. Artemis I, an uncrewed test flight, launched in November 2022. It was, by almost every measure, a success. Orion travelled 432,000 kilometers from Earth, entered a distant retrograde orbit around the Moon, and splashed down in the Pacific after 25.5 days in space. The heat shield, which needs to protect the crew capsule during re-entry at lunar return velocities, nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour, performed its function. But here's what the headlines celebrated quietly stepped around. The heat shield did not perform perfectly. Post-flight analysis revealed unexpected charring and ablation patterns on the Orion heat shield, areas where the thermal protection material burned away more extensively and differently than predicted. NASA's engineers needed to understand why. Was it a design flaw, a manufacturing anomaly, a gap in computational models? The investigation took months. The findings were sobering enough that they contributed to the delays cascading through the Artemis II timeline. So now we arrive at Artemis II, a crewed flight, a mission to prove that human beings can travel to the moon and back safely aboard this new architecture, and it will not land. That's not a failure, at least not in NASA's framing. In the agency's official roadmap, Artemis II is what engineers call a crewed flight test, a mission designed to validate the systems, procedures, and human factors involved in deep space travel before committing astronauts to the far riskier operations required for an actual landing. And a lunar landing, as we're about to explore in considerable depth, is not simply a harder version of what Artemis II will do. It is a fundamentally different challenge in almost every critical dimension. But that's not the full story. Because layered beneath the engineering rationale, beneath the heat shields and orbital mechanics and systems validation, lies a more complicated web of political decisions, contractor dependencies, budget constraints, and technological gaps that reveal something profound about humanity's current relationship with space exploration. Artemis II won't land on the moon for reasons that have as much to do with Congress as they do with combustion chambers, as much to do with history as with hardware. What scientists and engineers know, and what the public is only beginning to grasp, is that returning to the moon is not simply a matter of building a bigger rocket and pointing it at the right target. Between low Earth orbit and the lunar surface lies a gauntlet of systems, each of which must work perfectly, simultaneously, in the unforgiving vacuum of deep space. Artemis II will test some of those systems. Artemis III, the landing mission, requires all of them. And as of today, several of those critical components do not yet exist in flight-ready form. But what happened next, or rather, what hasn't happened yet, would shock even the most seasoned observers of the space industry. Let's establish something fundamental, because it changes everything that follows. The moon is not simply far away. That sentence sounds obvious, but its implications are rarely appreciated in full. The International Space Station, where astronauts have lived continuously since November 2000, orbits at an altitude of roughly 400 kilometers. At that distance, Earth's gravity is still nearly as strong as it is at the surface. The station and its occupants are technically in constant freefall, which is what orbit actually means. From the ISS, you could theoretically reach the surface in under an hour in an emergency. Communication is near instantaneous. Rescue, while enormously complex, is at least theoretically possible within days. The moon sits 384,400 kilometers away on average. That's not a bigger version of the same problem. That is a categorically different environment, with categorically different requirements, demanding categorically different solutions. At lunar distances, a signal from Earth takes 1.3 seconds to arrive and 1.3 seconds to return. In the realm of conversation and instruction, this is manageable. In the realm of automated abort sequences and split-second guidance corrections, it means the spacecraft must think for itself. Communication delay is not a technical inconvenience. It is a fundamental design constraint that shapes every system on the vehicle. Medical emergencies cannot be treated by calling in specialists. Food and water cannot be resupplied. If the propulsion system fails at the wrong moment, there is no rescue vehicle in the cosmos that can reach the crew in time. Every system must work, every backup must function, and the margin for error is thinner than almost anything human beings have attempted. Now here's where it gets truly strange. Artemis II won't experience any of this. Not fully. The mission's free return trajectory, the sweeping arc around the moon that gives the mission its impressive statistics, is specifically designed to minimize risk by leaning on orbital mechanics rather than propulsion burns. A free return trajectory means that if the propulsion system fails after the translunar injection burn, the spacecraft will naturally loop around the moon and return to Earth without any additional engine firings. Gravity does the work. It's the same principle that saved the Apollo 13 crew after their oxygen tank explosion in April 1970. This is not a criticism. This is sound engineering. You test what you can safely test before testing what you cannot. But here's what Artemis II will not test. Landing on the moon. And landing on the moon requires a piece of hardware that, as of the time of this writing, has never carried a human being, and has only flown in an early uncrewed demonstration. That hardware is the Human Landing System, and its story is one of the most remarkable, contentious, and revealing chapters in the entire Artemis saga. In 2021, NASA awarded a contract for the Human Landing System to SpaceX, the private aerospace company founded by Elon Musk. The vehicle selected was a lunar-adapted variant of Starship, SpaceX's enormous fully reusable rocket system, which the company is developing simultaneously as its primary orbital vehicle, its Mars transport architecture, and now its moon lander. The contract value for the initial demonstration mission was $2.9 billion, later expanded as NASA exercised additional options. The decision was controversial from the moment it was announced. NASA had initially planned to award multiple HLS contracts, a competitive architecture that would reduce risk and prevent single-point failure in the landing system supply chain. Budget limitations, specifically congressional appropriations that fell short of NASA's request, forced the agency to select only one provider. Blue Origin, founded by Jeff Bezos, mounted a legal challenge that delayed the program by months before ultimately being rejected by the Government Accountability Office. Dynetics, another competitor, also protested before accepting the outcome. The implications of this decision are almost too vast to comprehend. SpaceX's Starship is not a piece of existing proven technology, with a human landing variant under development. Starship itself is still in active development. The vehicle, which stands 121 meters tall when the Super Heavy booster is included, making it the largest rocket ever built, has been conducting a series of increasingly ambitious integrated test flights from SpaceX's Starbase facility in South Texas. Each flight has expanded the vehicle's demonstrated capabilities. Each flight has also revealed areas requiring refinement. What does this have to do with why Artemis II won't land? Everything, because Artemis III, the landing mission, cannot proceed until the human landing system is certified for crewed flight, and that certification depends on a chain of development, testing, and validation milestones for Starship that are running in parallel with, but independently of, the SLS and Orion system that will carry the astronauts from Earth to lunar orbit. Think of it this way. Imagine you're planning an expedition to the summit of a mountain that has never been climbed. You've built the helicopter that will carry your team to base camp, and you've tested it thoroughly. But the specialized climbing equipment that will take your team from base camp to the summit is still being designed, built, and tested by a different company. Your helicopter might be ready, but if the climbing gear isn't certified, the summit remains out of reach. Artemis II is the helicopter flight to base camp, and the climbing gear is still being tested. What scientists found next would challenge everything they assumed about the program's timeline. The lunar Starship, officially called the Starship Human Landing System, or HLS, is not simply a Starship with landing legs attached. It is a fundamentally modified variant of the vehicle, optimized for the specific requirements of lunar orbit rendezvous and surface operations. It requires a nose cone with docking capability to link up with Orion in lunar orbit, transferring the astronauts who will descend to the surface. It requires landing legs capable of supporting the vehicle on the uneven, potentially unstable lunar regolith. It requires ascent propulsion capable of launching from the lunar surface, a one-shot, zero-margin operation to return the surface crew to Orion waiting in orbit. And here's the detail that illustrates the magnitude of the challenge more clearly than any press release. The lunar Starship in its HLS configuration is too tall to fit inside any existing cleanroom facility on Earth. The vehicle is so large that much of its final assembly and testing will necessarily occur outdoors, or require purpose-built facilities that don't yet exist at operational scale. This is not a metaphor for ambition. This is a literal engineering constraint with cascading logistical implications. But there's more. Fuel. Specifically, the staggering quantity of propellant required to operate Starship in the lunar environment. The vehicle runs on liquid methane and liquid oxygen, cryogenic propellants that must be stored at temperatures approaching -180 degrees Celsius. To reach the moon and back from lunar orbit, the HLS Starship will need to be fully fueled not at a launch pad on Earth, but in Earth orbit, a process called propellant transfer that has never been demonstrated at operational scale in the history of spaceflight. NASA's plan requires that before the Artemis III landing, SpaceX will launch multiple Starship tanker missions to fill a propellant depot in Earth orbit, and then fuel the HLS vehicle there before it departs for the moon. Each tanker mission is itself a Starship launch. The propellant depot is itself an unproven system. The transfer of cryogenic propellants between vehicles in microgravity, managing fluid behavior in zero-G, preventing boil-off, achieving the necessary transfer rates, is a technical challenge that NASA and SpaceX engineers are working to solve but have not yet fully demonstrated. To put this in perspective, before Apollo 11 could land on the Moon, NASA had to solve the challenge of rendezvous in lunar orbit, a maneuver that had never been attempted. They did it. Human ingenuity solving impossible problems is not unprecedented. But the scale of what's required before Artemis III can land is not a single unsolved problem. It is a constellation of them, and all of this is why Artemis II will not land. Not because NASA lacks ambition, not because the mission has failed, but because the system required to land, the human landing system, the propellant transfer architecture, the surface operations procedures, are not ready. Artemis II is the flight that must happen before any of that can be safely attempted. It is indispensable. It is also, undeniably, incomplete. This means something profound. We are not, despite the headlines, on the verge of a simple return to the Moon. We are in the early chapters of a far more complicated story. One in which the landing is not just a step further down the same path, but a destination requiring a completely different vehicle, built by a private company using technologies never before demonstrated in space, assembled in a configuration that has never flown. And behind all of that, beneath the engineering and the contracts and the test flights, lies a political architecture that is at least as important as the physics. What you're about to learn might be the most consequential part of this entire story. Because the reason Artemis exists at all, and the reason it's structured the way it is, cannot be understood without understanding the machinery of congressional appropriations, the geography of aerospace manufacturing, and the quiet power of jobs programs disguised as space programs. Remember what we discussed about the cancellation of Constellation? Well, the ghost of that decision haunts Artemis in ways that determine not just what the program does, but how it does it, and how fast. The Space Launch System was not born from a clean sheet engineering exercise. In the aftermath of Constellation's cancellation, Congress was faced with a problem. Thousands of skilled aerospace workers across multiple states, Alabama, Louisiana, Utah, Florida, had been building components for the era's rockets that Constellation had planned to use. Factories were tooled, supply chains were established, and congressional representatives from those states were not about to let that workforce dissolve without a fight. In 2010, Congress passed the NASA Authorization Act. Buried within it was a mandate that would define the next decade of American human spaceflight. NASA was directed to develop a space launch system using existing assets, workforce, and contractor relationships from the Space Shuttle and Constellation programs. The vehicle's basic architecture, the core stage engines, the solid rocket boosters, the general configuration, was not purely the product of engineering optimization. It was the product of a political negotiation. This is not a condemnation. Every large government program exists within political reality. The Saturn V itself was shaped by the Cold War imperative to beat the Soviet Union to the Moon, not purely by optimal engineering choices. Understanding that Artemis's architecture reflects political as well as technical decisions is simply understanding how large-scale government-funded exploration actually works. But it does explain certain things. SLS uses RS-25 engines, the same engines that powered the Space Shuttle's main engines for 30 years. The engines are extraordinary. They're also expensive to produce, because their manufacturing process was designed for a program in which they would be recovered, refurbished, and reused. SLS throws them away with each launch. The cost per SLS launch has been estimated at between $2 and $4 billion, depending on how costs are calculated. By comparison, SpaceX's Falcon Heavy, currently the most capable commercially available rocket, costs roughly $100 million per launch. Even Starship, once fully operational and reusable, is projected to cost a fraction of SLS. This cost structure matters enormously for Artemis II's mission design. At $2 to $4 billion per launch, every SLS mission must be maximally justified. There is no room for a quick test flight that accomplishes minor objectives. Artemis II must accomplish everything it can possibly accomplish, while staying within the safety envelope that a crewed, free return trajectory provides. Landing on the Moon, which would require not just SLS and Orion, but HLS, which launches separately, would add layers of risk and complexity that the crewed flight test is not designed to validate. Some might wonder, couldn't NASA simply delay the crewed flight and wait until everything is ready for a landing? The answer is a masterclass in program management reality. human spaceflight programs that stand still tend to lose funding. Congressional support erodes when there are no visible milestones to point to. The workforce disperses, institutional momentum dissipates. The history of cancelled programs, Constellation, the Space Exploration Initiative of the 1980s, various Moon-to-Mars studies of the 1990s, is a history of programs that waited too long to show progress. Artemis II is visible progress. It is humans in space, going farther than any human has gone since 1972. That visibility is not merely good public relations, it is program protection. And yet, here is where the story grows more complex. The 4 astronauts sitting atop SLS on that launch day will know something that the press releases won't emphasize. Their mission, for all its historic significance, is also a proof of concept for a landing that depends on a vehicle built by a company that is simultaneously trying to reach Mars, develop a point-to-point Earth transport system, and fulfill a constellation of commercial satellite launch contracts. The human landing system development exists within SpaceX's broader strategic priorities, and those priorities are not always perfectly aligned with NASA's Artemis timeline. Peak emotional realization arrives here. Consider what the 4 Artemis II astronauts will experience. They will travel farther into space than any human beings in 53 years. They will see the moon's surface from closer than any crewed vehicle has approached since Gene Cernan lifted off from it in December 1972 and spoke his final words from the lunar surface. A quiet, understated farewell that he would later describe as the most profound moment of his life. The Artemis II crew will see those same mountains, those same craters, the same ancient geological record of the solar system's violent formation, and they will not land. That is not a failure. But it is a specific kind of incompleteness that carries emotional weight beyond the technical explanation. Astronaut Victor Glover, who will be the first black astronaut to fly to the moon and back, has spoken about what the mission represents, not just for him personally, but for everyone whose image of space exploration has historically looked different from what it was. Christina Koch, who set the record for the longest spaceflight by a woman during her stay on the ISS, will become the first woman to travel to the moon and back. These are not incidental biographical details. They are part of Artemis's explicit mandate to create a more expansive and inclusive vision of human space exploration. But here's what the mission also represents, in a context rarely discussed publicly. Artemis II will stress test Orion's life support systems over the 10-day mission duration in the deep space radiation environment. It will validate the communication and navigation architecture for deep space crewed operations. It will exercise the procedures for translunar injection, lunar flyby, and Earth re-entry at lunar return velocity. It will generate data, telemetry, biological monitoring, systems performance records that will directly inform the design of Artemis III's mission profile. In this sense, Artemis II is less a mission and more a data collection exercise of incomparable value. Every temperature reading from Orion's thermal control system, every dosimeter measurement of the radiation the crew absorbs, every performance parameter from the European service module, all of it flows back into models that will determine whether Artemis III is survivable, not whether it's technically possible, whether the humans inside come home alive and healthy. That framing shifts something. It doesn't make Artemis II's lack of landing any less significant, but it situates the mission within a logic that is, when fully understood, defensible, even if the political and budgetary forces that shape that logic are more complicated than the official narrative suggests. Now let's talk about the moon itself, because the specific location where Artemis III plans to land changes everything about why the entire program sequence matters. The Artemis III landing target is the lunar South Pole, specifically a region near the Shackleton crater, a permanently shadowed area where temperatures in the deepest craters plunge below -200 degrees Celsius, making them the coldest places in the inner solar system. These permanently shadowed regions have never seen direct sunlight, not in billions of years, and within their perpetual darkness, data from multiple orbital missions, including NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, India's Chandrayaan-1, and NASA's LCROSS impactor mission, has confirmed the presence of water ice. Water ice on the moon is not merely scientifically interesting, it is strategically transformative. Water can be split into hydrogen and oxygen. oxygen can be used for breathing. Hydrogen and oxygen together are rocket propellant. A lunar South Pole base with access to water ice could, in principle, become a refueling depot for missions deeper into the solar system, reducing the mass that must be launched from Earth's gravity well for each subsequent mission. This is the foundation of the economic and strategic logic behind permanent lunar presence. The Moon is not just a destination, it is a potential stepping stone. But the lunar South Pole is also one of the most technically demanding landing environments imaginable. The terrain is heavily cratered. The sunlight arrives at extreme angles. The sun never rises more than a few degrees above the horizon, creating harsh lighting conditions with deep shadows that make navigation and hazard avoidance extraordinarily challenging. The permanently shadowed regions that contain the water ice are also regions where solar power is unavailable. Any operations inside those regions require alternative power sources, thermal management systems capable of surviving the extreme cold, and equipment designed to operate in conditions unlike anything in prior human spaceflight history. Artemis II will not test any of this. Artemis II cannot. The free return trajectory around the Moon does not bring the spacecraft anywhere near the South Pole in any operationally meaningful sense. These are challenges that belong to Artemis III and to every mission beyond it. And here's the connection that ties everything together in a way that the program's public communications rarely make explicit. The reason Artemis II won't land is not simply that it's a test flight, it's that landing at the lunar South Pole, the specific target of Artemis III, requires a convergence of technologies, procedures, and infrastructure that are not yet ready. The human landing system, the propellant transfer architecture, South Pole-specific navigation and hazard avoidance systems, pressure suits designed for operations in extremely cold, shadowed environments, power systems capable of sustaining operations where solar panels are useless. Each of these elements is in development. None of them are complete. The program cannot proceed faster than its slowest critical component, and so Artemis II exists, this extraordinary, historic, fundamentally incomplete mission, as the bridge between where humanity is and where humanity needs to be. The gap between those two places is wider than most people realize, and it is worth examining in detail because the implications reach far beyond any single mission's timeline. Let's pause for a moment and consider what this really means. We are living in a period that historians of space exploration will almost certainly identify as a transition epoch, a moment when the infrastructure, economics, and geopolitical context of human spaceflight are being fundamentally restructured, and Artemis II sits at the center of that restructuring not as a triumph or a failure, but as a symptom, a data point, a reflection of where we actually are, as opposed to where we wish we were. The most significant change in the spaceflight landscape over the past 2 decades is not any single rocket or spacecraft. It's the emergence of the commercial space sector as a genuine partner, and in some respects a competitor, to government space agencies. SpaceX's Falcon 9 has become the workhorse of global orbital launch, flying more missions per year than any other rocket in history. The company's Crew Dragon capsule has transported NASA astronauts to the ISS since 2020. Blue Origin's New Shepard has flown dozens of passengers to the edge of space and back. Rocket Lab, Firefly, Relativity Space, and a constellation of other companies are competing for the growing commercial launch market. This landscape was not fully anticipated when Artemis's architecture was conceived. The program was designed, by law, as we discussed, to use existing government infrastructure and workforce. But the world it launched into has changed substantially. The result is a program that is simultaneously the most powerful government space initiative since Apollo, and, in some respects, already being outpaced by commercial developments that were unimaginable when the mandate was written. But this raises an even bigger question than the one we started with. If commercial launch providers can reach orbit for 1/100th of the cost of SLS, if commercial spacecraft development is advancing at a pace that outstrips government programs, what is the long-term role of NASA in human exploration beyond Earth? Is the agency's future to be a customer and regulator of commercial capabilities, a builder and operator of scientific infrastructure, a flag-carrying institution whose value is symbolic as much as technical? These are not rhetorical provocations. They are active debates within the aerospace community, within Congress, and within NASA itself. And Artemis II exists squarely within that debate. as an artifact of one answer to those questions, built in a political environment that may be evolving toward a different answer. The competition dimension adds another layer of urgency that is rarely acknowledged in official communications. China's space program has advanced with remarkable speed over the past decade. The China National Space Administration's lunar exploration program, Chang'e, has achieved a series of increasingly ambitious milestones. Chang'e 4 landed on the far side of the Moon in January 2019, the first time any spacecraft had done so. Chang'e 5 returned lunar samples to Earth in December 2020, the first lunar sample return since the Soviet Lunar 24 mission in 1976. Chang'e 6 landed in the South Pole Aitken Basin, the Moon's largest impact crater, and returned samples from that region in 2024. China has stated its intention to land taikonauts on the Moon before 2030. The Chinese lunar exploration roadmap includes a permanent lunar research station, with Russia as a stated partner. The geopolitical implications of a Chinese crewed lunar landing, particularly a landing at the South Pole, and near the water ice deposits that make permanent lunar presence viable, are not lost on American policymakers. This is in part why the Artemis program has been explicitly framed in terms of American leadership, rather than purely scientific exploration. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson has stated publicly that there is a race to the Moon, and that the United States must win it. Whether or not one accepts the competitive framing, and many scientists find it a distraction from the genuine scientific objectives, it is shaping the political pressure under which Artemis operates, and that pressure, paradoxically, may be both accelerating and impeding progress. The desire to reach the Moon before China creates urgency that translates into budget requests and program prioritization. But it also creates pressure to announce milestones and declare readiness before the technical foundations fully support those declarations. The history of programs pushed to launch before they're ready, from Challenger to early commercial launch failures, suggests that urgency and safety exist in genuine tension. Artemis II, to its considerable credit, has not been rushed in that direction. The delays that have pushed the mission from 2024 to 2025 to its current projected 2026 window reflect NASA's insistence on resolving the heat shield anomaly from Artemis I before trusting human lives to Orion. That is the program functioning correctly. That is the lesson of Apollo 1, of Challenger, of Columbia, hard-learned and apparently retained. To put this in perspective, Apollo 1's fire killed 3 astronauts in a test on the launch pad in January 1967. The program paused for 20 months. The redesigned capsule flew successfully. Apollo 11 landed on the Moon in July 1969. The pause was not a failure. It was the reason the program ultimately succeeded. The willingness to stop, investigate, redesign, and only then proceed is not weakness. It is the foundation of any reliable complex system. Artemis II's delays are, in this reading, a sign of institutional health rather than dysfunction. The question is whether the political and budgetary environment can sustain the patience required for that institutional health to translate into mission success. Here's an aspect of Artemis that receives almost no mainstream attention, but may ultimately determine the program's success or failure more than any single piece of hardware. The Artemis Accords, signed initially by 8 nations in October 2020 and expanded to include dozens of signatories in the years since. The Artemis Accords are a set of principles for peaceful and cooperative civil space exploration. They establish norms around transparency, interoperability of space systems, coordination on orbital debris, and the extraction of space resources. Critically, they represent an attempt to build a geopolitical coalition around the American vision of a lunar exploration before China and Russia can establish a competing set of norms. The Accords have been signed by European partners Japan, Canada, Australia, the United Arab Emirates, and many others. Canada's commitment is directly reflected in the Artemis II crew. Jeremy Hansen, a Canadian Space Agency astronaut, will become the first non-American to fly to the Moon and back. His inclusion is not coincidental. It is the program making visible and tangible the international coalition that the Accords represent. This matters for reasons beyond diplomacy. The lunar infrastructure required for sustainable human presence, power systems, communications relays, surface transportation, resource extraction equipment, will not be built by any single nation or even any single agency. It will require contributions from multiple countries, multiple companies, and multiple technological traditions. The Artemis Accords framework is the political scaffolding within which that collaboration can occur. Artemis II is, in this sense, also a coalition-building event. It is a demonstration to partner nations that the American commitment to shared lunar exploration is real, funded, and flying. The mission's success, or failure, will have consequences for international space cooperation that extend well beyond the trajectory of any single spacecraft. And then there is the human factor, which no amount of engineering specification can fully capture. The 4 people aboard Artemis II will spend approximately 10 days in a spacecraft the size of a large SUV. They will be farther from Earth than any human being since December 1972. They will see Earth reduced to a blue marble, a perspective that every astronaut who has experienced it describes as permanently transformative, capable of dissolving the abstract intellectual understanding that we all live on a sphere into something visceral and irreversible. They will also be exposed to radiation at levels that no astronaut on the ISS experiences. Earth's magnetic field provides significant protection for the space station. Beyond it, in the deep space environment between Earth and Moon, the cosmic ray flux is substantially higher. Solar particle events, eruptions of high-energy particles from the Sun that can arrive with little warning, represent a genuine radiation hazard. Orion's radiation shelter provides some mitigation, but the crew of Artemis II will absorb more radiation in 10 days than ISS astronauts typically absorb in 6 months. The biological data gathered from that exposure will be invaluable for planning longer missions, including any Artemis III surface stay, which could extend to 6.5 days on the surface. Managing radiation risk for surface operations near the lunar South Pole, where the geometry of the terrain creates some natural shielding from cosmic rays, but also means certain solar particle events could arrive without warning, is an active area of research that Artemis II's data will directly inform. What emerges from all of this is a portrait of Artemis II as something richer and more complicated than either its advocates or its critics typically describe. It is not simply a test flight. It is not simply a political milestone. It is not simply a failure to land. It is a node in an extraordinarily complex system of technical development and geopolitical maneuvering, commercial transformation, and scientific aspiration, all taking place simultaneously, all interdependent, all pointing toward a future that is far more uncertain than any official press release will acknowledge. But here's what we know with reasonable confidence. If Artemis II succeeds, if Orion and its crew execute the free return trajectory without critical anomalies, if the systems perform within their design envelopes, if the radiation data falls within acceptable parameters, if the heat shield survives re-entry as designed, then the path to Artemis III becomes substantially clearer. Not guaranteed, not imminent, but clearer. And if Artemis III lands at the lunar South Pole, if 2 human beings descend from lunar orbit in a SpaceX Starship human landing system and step onto regolith that has never felt the weight of a boot, it will represent something that transcends the program's political and budgetary complications. It will be the confirmation that human beings can return to the Moon with a new generation of systems, new partners, new purposes, and new possibilities. That is worth the wait, even if the wait is longer than anyone initially promised. We began with a question that sounded simple. Why won't Artemis II actually land on the Moon? The answer we found is anything but simple. It is a story about the physics of deep space and the politics of congressional appropriations, about heat shields and geopolitical competition, about private rockets that may be the most transformative technology in the history of spaceflight, and government institutions carrying the weight of history and the constraints that weight imposes. About 4 human beings who will travel farther than anyone has travelled in more than half a century, and still not reach the surface they're circling. Artemis II won't land because the system that lands isn't ready, because the architecture of Artemis was built to a political mandate as much as an engineering specification, because the Moon's South Pole demands capabilities that have never been assembled in one place, and assembling them takes time that enthusiasm cannot compress into something shorter, because the program is, beneath the headlines, conducting the most rigorous crewed systems validation since the Apollo program, and that validation is as essential to the eventual landing as the landing vehicle itself. And because exploration, Real exploration has never moved at the pace we wish it would. It moves at the pace that safety and competence and institutional reality allow. Apollo took 8 years from Mercury to the surface of the Moon. It required the deaths of 3 astronauts and the near loss of a 4th crew to teach the lessons that made subsequent success possible. The journey was not linear. It was not triumphant at every step. It was the most ambitious thing human beings had ever attempted, and it was filled with the specific, mundane, irreplaceable work of making impossible things possible one problem at a time. Artemis II is one problem at a time. What it will tell us about Orion, about the radiation environment, about the capacity of 4 human beings to function effectively in deep space over 10 days, will shape everything that follows. The landing, when it comes, will have been made more likely by every measurement taken, every system validated, every anomaly caught and corrected during this mission. The Moon is 384,400 kilometers away. It has been waiting 3.5 billion years for the conditions that make its water ice geologically stable. It will wait a little longer for the humans who are coming, but one thread remains unresolved. The thread that may matter most in the long run. What happens to Artemis if the political winds shift? Programs have been cancelled before. Constellation was cancelled after $9 billion and years of development. The vehicles being built right now, the people training right now, the international partnerships being formalised right now, none of it is immune to the next budget cycle, the next administration, the next geopolitical recalculation. The Moon isn't going anywhere. Human ambition, human curiosity, the drive to go farther and deeper and higher, that isn't going anywhere either. But whether this particular program, this particular architecture, this particular coalition of nations and companies and engineers reaches the surface, that question remains open. As we continue to explore, the answers will come, one mission at a time.